Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me tonight. This is episode 2 of season 3 of the P.W.P Sessions podcast. I am your host, Noelle Figueroa, and I am excited tonight to have the opportunity to interview another awesome poet in their own right by the name of Mary Brancaccio. And this is the introduction. Sorry about that. For those not already familiar with this podcast, the P.W.P Sessions podcast or the P.W.P Sessions podcast, Poets with Purpose Sessions podcast is a podcast that I created where I interview new or established authors of poetry, as well as rappers or MCs. I feature a performance of their work along with an audience Q&A session. I am your host, Noelle Figueroa. I am a poet, author, blogger, workshop facilitator, and event host, and I am the creator of the P.W.P Sessions podcast. Now, tonight's guest is Mary Brancaccio, and this is her bio. Mary Brancaccio is a poet and teacher. Fierce Geometry Poems was featured on the Academy of American Poets reading list for National Poetry Month 2023. Her work has appeared in Naugatuck River Review, Minerva Rising, Edison Literary Review, Rattle, and other journals. Her poem, Tea with Ann, was featured on Major Jackson's podcast, The Slowdown. Brancaccio's poetry is included in several national and international anthologies, including Writing the Land, Northeast, Writing the Land, Maine, Veils, Halos, and Shackles, International Poetry on the Oppression and Empowerment of Women, and Farewell to Nuclear, Welcome to Renewable Energy, Japanese English bilingual edition. She has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize, and her website is ghostgirlpoet.com. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you Miss Mary Brancaccio. Good evening, Mary. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing fine. Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, thank you so much for being my guest. I'm excited to have this conversation. So I'm going to start off with a basic question. Who is Mary Brancaccio? How would you describe yourself or define yourself?
Oh, that's always like one of those fraught questions, But so I think to begin with, I would probably describe myself as a person who has a tremendous amount of curiosity about the world, and I think that sort of drives the way I live and the way I work in the world. I'm also driven to be creative. I find that if I'm not creating, if I'm not doing something creative, if I'm not writing or doing other things like that, I get extremely restless. I develop a sort of an agitation. It's like I can't live with myself until I start doing something. I'm one of those people who can dive into internet wormholes for hours on all kinds of different subjects, everything from comets, and who discovers comets, and history, philosophy, ecology. I'm currently a bit obsessed with climate change and how we're going to get out of the hole we're in. So I spend a good bit of time looking at things like that. Just in terms of my background, I was born in Washington, D.C., grew up in Falls Church, Virginia. My parents were originally from Buffalo, New York. My dad grew up in a very working class family, and my mother did as well. My dad put himself through through college by working in the steel mills and painting water towers and cleaning rail cars. So that was kind of the background that this kind of working class background that my parents brought with them when they moved to DC. My dad got into law school and went to Georgetown Law School, and that kind of changed the trajectory of my family, I think. But I think the values that they brought with them really guided the way I was raised and the way my brothers were raised. And there was this tremendous focus on being a kind of skilled, productive person right? Being able to do things that were of some benefit to other people, and being self-sufficient in a way. So if you knew carpentry, or you could fix a leaky sink, I mean, those were sort of like heroes in our family.
Right.
Because, a lot of family, in those days depended on somebody in the family who could kind of help make things work.
Right. Definitely, definitely. Now, tell me about your journey into poetry. Like, what was the pivotal moment for you where you realized that poetry was something that you can pursue for yourself?
I didn't start out being a poet when I was younger. I had a really different trajectory. I started pursuing journalism. I went to college and I started working in college radio. And when I was able to parlay that into some internships in college radio, and then in Washington, D.C., and worked in newsrooms originally, ripping copy, making the police beat phone calls, producing on-air call-in shows and things like that. And then later, I met my husband in broadcasting, and the two of us moved out to San Francisco, and I couldn't get a job in radio, but I got a job in a TV newsroom and worked at KPIX TV in San Francisco. And we were there from the mid to late 80s. And of course, the big story was the AIDS crisis. And I found myself on a team covering AIDS in San Francisco. It was a program called AIDS Lifeline. It was part of our regular newscast. And then we did these almost like quarterly specials on what was going on. And we covered everything from what was happening in terms of medicine and the science to try to move toward treating people and helping people who were infected with HIV. And then also policy stories. I mean, back then we had a president who didn't say the word AIDS for, I think, like the first three, for the first, whole term of his presidency, Reagan. I mean, it was like, it was like the subject nobody could talk about. And yet, the world I was living in was a world of absolute crisis. And so I felt very driven by that work. And I think for a long time, I saw myself working more in that area, in journalism. But we also, I also got a bit burned out. And at one point, my husband's job took us overseas to London. And so we had young kids at that time, and it was sort of this break away from that. And I ended up moving into education. I felt like, well, how can we change the world, right? And I kept thinking, younger people.
Right.
Younger people, if we can work with younger people to change mindsets, maybe something good can come from this. So it was a long time before I found my way back to poetry. I had written poetry in college and in high school. I loved poetry. I mean, when I was a kid, I loved it. I don't know why. It just really, I was so excited by it. I thought, I remember getting an assignment when I was in grade school. And it was one of these like probably throwaway assignments at the end of the year, where the teacher was like, put together a booklet of your 10 favorite poems. And I'm sure like most kids went to the library, pulled some anthology off the shelf and copied the first 10 poems they could find. I was like, that sent me like almost on a crisis, because I read book after book and I couldn't narrow it down to just 10. It took me a long time.
Now, when you first started writing poetry, what were the subjects that you first started writing about?
Well, I think because of my age, I was still in my teens then. It was very moody stuff. It was sort of, the very kind of emotional stuff that you wrestle with when you're an adolescent about, who are you, breakups, falling in love, falling out of love. I struggled a bit with depression, so I wrote some really kind of dark poems about that.
Right.
But I had a hard time really getting into poetry until I was probably in my 40s.
Mm. And what would you say your motivation would be to be a poet? You know, because every poet has their own motivations or inspirations for writing poetry. What would you say your motivation is?
I think these days I feel like I just need to. I think part of me feels a little bit like a journalist, like we've got to record the world as it is now. I have a tremendous sense that we're in this period of really rapid change, certainly in terms of the climate, but also politically. And I think I'm trying to preserve the things that are beautiful or wonderful or important to me and maybe to other people about the world that we're living in now. I sometimes feel like I'm writing to a future generation to sort of say, maybe, yeah, we knew what was coming. We knew where things were going. And this is where we were. And this is how we thought of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think some of that is driving me now.
Right. And I agree with that point, because when you're thinking on those terms of like documenting, so to speak, your experiences for future generations, that's essentially what the poets that came before us have done. Like, for example, Maya Angelou, Sonia Sanchez, Rita Dove, Robert Frost, just a few to give an example. They documented their experiences and the time periods that they were living in. And some or all of those that I've mentioned, like Maya Angelou is no longer with us, for example, but her writing lives on.
You bet.
And essentially, what you're saying is true. We're documenting the now for the generations that will come after us, because we're obviously not going to live forever, but our writing will.
Right.
So it's a beautiful thing when you can have something that can be pretty much preserved, for generations.
It's somebody once said to me recently about the need to make a case also about what we understood about our time and how the world felt to us, how this sort of unraveling sometimes that I think we feel in the world. And yet there's other things too. I have a daughter who's working in architecture now, and she's finishing her academic work on it, and she feels very driven by this need to create a sense of hope for the future, and she's thinking that a lot of difficult things are going to come when we start talking about sea level rise and communities that are going to be impacted by extreme weather events. I mean, there's a lot of not so pleasant things out there.
Right.
But her idea is that we have to come up with this way of looking ahead and offering some hope to future generations of like, okay, a life after this, right? There'll be a life after this crisis. There'll be a way, maybe not all of us will be there, but there will be something that will go on. And I think if maybe that is a place for poetry now. I mean, maybe that's what we need to do, is to sort of say, yeah, there's a lot of struggle, but there's a future, and it may be better.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, dealing with your overall journey as a writer and a poet, who or what would you say helped you to develop your skills as a writer and a poet?
I was very lucky. I had a number of people who came into my life at just the right time and just when I needed them. I think my most informal and most important informal mentor was a woman named Holly Scalera, who was a local poet here in New Jersey, in South Orange, New Jersey. And she was a gardener, and she did a lot of different things. She's a very creative person. And she set up she would just have people come into her living room, and we would sit around and write poems. And it was men, women. It was a whole, kind of an eclectic group of people, and it changed and people came and went. But it was the first place where somebody was encouraging me to write and encouraging and wanting to hear what I wrote, which is really important. I think one of the hardest things when you're first writing poetry is to have any feeling that anybody's listening or anybody wants to hear what you wrote. So I also had another good friend of mine who was a co-teacher of mine, and she convinced me to go to the Iowa Writers Festival, which is their summer workshops. And I took a workshop with a woman there named a poet, Julia Patterson. And that was just like a quantum leap in terms of like starting to understand how to do the craft of poetry. And she was tremendous. After that, I was doing a correspondence course with her for a while. She would send me a prompt. I'd write poems. I'd send them back. She'd give me notes on the poems and another prompt. And that was really a lifeline for me before I could really get into anything else. I did go and I did an MFA program at Drew University, and I was teaching at the time, and it was a low residency, so I was able to squeeze it in around my job. And there I had a number of mentors like Ira Sadoff, who was a family friend and somebody who really taught me the importance of the line, like how to think about a line, like what are you putting in a line of poetry, right? And the importance of, like, he would always say, every word in your line has to matter. It has to be important, it has to carry the weight of the line. And that was, that's a tough lesson. It's a tough lesson. It's a lesson you kind of take in, but to actually process that and pull that off is something that took a long time. I had another mentor there, Jane Mead, who's no longer with us. And one of the things that I loved about her is she introduced me to a ton of women poets. I hadn't read that many women poets. There wasn't, when I was coming up through school, we weren't being exposed to contemporary poets. Right? They weren't out there. They were hard to find. But I read a whole bunch of amazing poets and saw what they were doing. The other thing she did is she said, sit down for 20 minutes a day and just write random lines. Don't even try to write a poem, just practice writing lines, which was that's an incredible help. Other poets that were there, Michael Waters, he taught me a lot about musicality and how to think about, using the rhythms that I was already developing in my poetry, but how to really bring them out and enhance the work of the sound work of a poem. And Judith Vollmer, who helped me pull together my manuscript, which I think formed the foundation of my first book, really gave me a tremendous amount of courage in terms of understanding that my stories were important too, right? That the world of a woman in her everyday life might have some resonance, and that was an incredible boost to have somebody say that those stories were important.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's excellent. Which brings me to ask you about Fierce Geometry. First of all, congratulations on this project.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sure it was an exciting achievement for you. What was the goal or the motivation to put together this collection of poetry?
Well, I think when I came out of the MFA, and I had a manuscript, but a manuscript is not a book, right? A manuscript is a starting point, I think, for most people coming out. And so I stayed with that. I wrote new poems. I reorganized work. I created a whole middle section that was based on, for a long time, I'd been trying to write about my relationship with my mother. I had a difficult relationship with her. My mother was a survivor of trauma. She was sexually abused. She was, at one point, her mother was in a mental hospital, and she was placed in an orphanage with her sisters. And she had a pretty rough childhood. And as a result, she was a difficult person to live with. I mean, a lot of the things that I think we now understand about trauma, people didn't really talk about then, and so she was moody, and she could be abusive. She was, at one point, she was suicidal, and I was 10 or 11, and she was sharing her suicidal ideations with me, telling me how she was going to kill herself. And, there were times when I was a kid where I remember getting up in the middle of the night and sneaking into her bedroom and putting my hand over her face to feel whether or not she was breathing. I mean, a lot of that, I felt like I suppressed a lot of that. I think a lot of people do, when you go through things like that. It took me a long time to really be able to access that, to open that, and really dig into that and begin to make sense of it. There was another time when my mother got angry at me for something stupid. I missed a school bus. I was supposed to stay after late at school for something, and then I missed one bus. And anyway, it ended up becoming this huge, my mother was panicking. I wasn't at the bus when blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so when I got home, and I think I was about 14, my mom was, like a lot of moms, really ticked off and screaming at me and yelling at me. And that's sort of routine, right? And then she reached over and she grabbed a pair of scissors off the kitchen counter. And she started coming at me with the scissors. And I didn't know what to do. I was kind of freaking out. And she grabbed, I had really long hair. I'd grown my hair really long. And she grabbed my hair and started and cut my hair, like cut a big swath of my hair off. And at that point, I just ran, and I remember like hiding in my room and locking the door and hiding in my closet. And she's banging on the door. And then I think eventually she kind of like spent whatever rage she had. And then, started kind of like cajoling me to come out. Right. And then, of course, she had to cut the rest of my hair off, because otherwise people would know what had happened. So, yeah, so there were, I think I ended up, so the irony of that is that years later, my mother had lung cancer, and I was with her, and I was with her that when she first started radiation treatment. And the first thing, I don't know if you've ever had anybody who's gone through radiation, but an early thing is your hair falls out. Right. So my mother's hair started falling out. And people had said to her, you should cut your hair before. And she figured like, oh, it's going to fall out. Just wait till it falls out. So the problem is it falls out in mats, and it's just really impossible. So then she said to me, can you cut my hair off? So it ended up being this like kind of surreal moment for me, where I'm cutting my mother's hair off. And then she says to me, do you remember when I cut when I cut your hair? And she said to me, I didn't think you'd ever forgive me. And it was kind of like this like weird circular thing.
Right.
So part of Fierce Geometry, I think the middle section of the book, was me coming to terms with this very complicated relationship with my mother, who I loved in turns, and then also had other feelings toward her that were, really difficult, anger and frustration and things like that. And I ended up writing it in a series of fragments. There was no way to make a cohesive narrative out of that, right? And so it was a series of fragments, and I was struggling with like, what's the title of this? And I read a Jonathan Safran Foer book, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, which is his novel about 9/11. And in there was this line where one of the narrator says something about the cancer of never letting go. And I was like, oh my God, that's the title. That's the title.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, first I want to say, that I empathize with you, because I can't even begin to imagine how that would feel to experience all of that. So I applaud you for sharing that. I know that's something that's deeply personal, but I thank you for your transparency. And would I be correct in saying, when you touch on subjects such as this through your poetry, do you feel a sense of healing getting it all on paper?
I think it's, yes. I mean, I think it's the beginning of healing. I think getting it out on paper is a way to begin processing it. And especially because I think there can be ways where we hold on to really dark stuff and we don't process it because it's too scary. It's too hard. We don't feel that we're in a safe enough place to process it. But when we do start writing about it, we change the control. I think we get control over it rather than it controlling us. I actually recently led a workshop up in Maine on this idea of writing to heal. And I did it with another woman who's a cancer survivor and had written a book about her just going through the process of dealing with, with that. And I think both of, she and I shared this feeling that writing is one of the ways we get through that. We work through the very, very heavy stuff of healing from trauma.
Right. And in addition to being able to write about things like this, did you have an opportunity to reconcile with your mother?
I kind of did. I mean, I was there a lot with my mother off and on, and I write about this in the poem. I felt like in many ways we got completely close. I mean, we were very, very close. I think, did we completely reconcile? I think we got really close to that. But there was a part of us, I think one of the things that happens between people when there's been something difficult like this is that sometimes there's like a little bit of a gap, right? So you can say, yes, I love you, I forgive you, whatever. There's a little bit of a gap. Sometimes I think for me, I felt like I was holding back a little bit. Like there were some things I couldn't say to my mother because I was still too scared. I was scared of maybe of the monster within, right? Which was unfair because I think by then she'd long passed that, but I was scared of that. I had an interesting thing happen. I was reading the Tibetan book of living and dying, and I was reading that while, my mother was ill, and I would read it bits and pieces. It took me years to finish it, but there was after my mother died, there was a wonderful piece in there about reconciling with somebody who's passed. And it was this idea of like writing to them, like writing almost like a letter, imagining you having that conversation that you wished you had had, where you could have been very open and they could have listened to you openly without any anger or without defensiveness. So you write to them, and then you imagine them speaking back to you. And again, they're in the afterlife. They're not carrying all of the emotional defensiveness.
Right.
So in that middle section of my book, I wrote a poem to my mother. And then I wrote a poem that I sarcastically described, because mom always gets the last word. I wrote a poem that I thought what she would have said back to me had she still been alive. So
that's excellent that you were able to express yourself on that subject in particular, which kind of leads me to my next question. In terms of your writing overall, how important is it to you to make sure that you're representing yourself in your totality? Because you hear the word representation thrown around in different circles from time to time. In terms of yourself and in terms of your writing, how important is it to you that when you're writing, that you're representing yourself in your totality, whether you're dealing with your femininity, your educational background, cultural, religion, if it applies to you, all of the things that make you who you are, Like, how important is it to you to make sure that you're representing yourself in your totality?
To me, I think it's if I decide I'm going to put a poem out in the world, I have to feel that it's authentic to me.
Mhm.
I have to feel like whatever I've put in that poem, it is me. It's honest. And that getting to that point of honesty and authenticity is a tricky thing. And I think I've been very lucky to read a number of poets who were doing that, and to know poets who did that. And I think Joan Larkin, Ira Sadoff are two poets that I think of that were very open and honest about their own lives and their own experiences. Ed Hirsch wrote an amazing book called Gabriel about his son's death, where I think he was open and honest about the complexity of his relationship with his son. And I think those kinds of things gave me they were kind of like the mentor texts, I guess, for lack of a better word, for how to do this work. I mean, you hear a lot in poetry workshops and that about digging deeper. And I think it's really easy to, when we think about digging deeper, we have to really think about this other thing, which I also like, about no more masks, right? There's a wonderful poem by Muriel Rukeyser where she's like, she's writing in the voice of Orpheus, but then she sort of breaks it out. She's like, no more masks, right? So I think that's important, to figure out a way of like not trying to position yourself or put a mask on and pretend to be someone that you're not. And that's hard. I mean, I think it's the thing that scared me about publishing, because if you're putting yourself out there, you feel vulnerable. It can be really tough.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I definitely I'm definitely in full agreement that transparency is necessary, and there is a level of vulnerability when you are, sharing your work with the world. And I believe that provides the perfect segue to the next segment of this interview. It's time for you, Mary, to take the mic.
Okay.
At this time, Mary, you are welcome to share up to 5 poems. You don't have to do 5, but I like to give you this opportunity to share some poetry to give our audience an idea of who you are and what your writing style is like. So at this time, the floor is yours.
Okay. So I'm gonna jump around a little bit. I'm gonna read a few poems from Fierce Geometry. I'll start with the poem that is where the title comes from, because I think that'll give people an idea of why I call it Fierce Geometry. It's called I Discover Geometry. And this is based on me, thinking back on when I was a sophomore in high school. I was not a huge fan of math, with the exception of geometry, which I fell in love with graphing shapes. And it's called I Discover Geometry. I guide my carbon pencil's point through arc and line as I birth elegant forms on fields of graphing paper, tessellations and dilations. I learn of love, the great transversal that creates congruence from disparate beings. In school, I never master complex sums, but still I learn. Slopes and arrows flood my dreams as my body shifts weight, drops its ballast of gravity into my pelvis. My breasts and hips bend lines into curves. Startled by the fast changing landscape, I conjure patterns on pages, a secret inside my delicate arches, a face beneath mine, antipodal points caught within spheres of attraction. Years later, I found the man I sought. My thumb marks the nape of his neck. My fingers navigate scapulae of his back. his nipples raised ridge. My hands ride the concavity of his lower back, angles of knees and elbows nestled together as fluidity open to possible worlds, damp hair pressed against his hip. In time, our breathless gasps subside. We fall towards sleep, embossed on wrinkled sheets. We have weathered broken space, parallel lives of discontent, skewed paths to learn fidelity is less a ring than a Mobius strip. What little I knew of love's fierce geometry. I want to just I'm going to hold up the cover for a minute. So on the cover of the book is a picture of Death Valley. And it was a favorite place that we traveled to when we were living in California with our kids. And the floor of the valley looks like tessellations to me. And I think of it also as being the way our lives intersect with the lives of other people and affect one another. And so that's also playing into that. I'm going to read another one called Dirt and Rust. On that rutted road through the Midi-Atlas, I fell hard for Muhammad's deserts. First startled by absence of trees and vast nothingness, I learned to spot the flowers in the dust. Bitter tang rose from camel turds glistening with grass. Road apples. I made him laugh when I called them that. Our last trip together was his final gift. Even now, as I travel America's West, I compare his world and mine. Once in Death Valley at an old ghost town, I searched for remnants, rusted nails, cans hammered flat for shingles. I dreamt the storm song on a miner's tin roof as he lay awake, thoughts of the woman he'd send for when he'd panned his fortune from dirt. In the hills, wide alluvial fans mapped gathered destinies during rare rains, congruent paths, what he and I would never have, our lives touching for some years, like palm lines of life and heart that blend before diverging. He'd ask, what does it mean, hick? You're a real hick. Without translation, histories are lost. When the plane arrived without him, I stood for hours under the dogwoods, afraid to move, flooded with longing so deep, I was sure I'd drown. I tried to remember our last phone call over that faint line from Rabat, his hope for a visa, his wait for an interview. When Fatima hennaed my hands, he sat between us to interpret. It took 3 hours. She traced each painted line with melted wax. To pass the time, she shared the story of her life, her husband in America, who took a new wife and left her waiting. All the years spent praying to Allah, imploring fakirs. She read my future in red clay. On my left palm, a rose. On the right, a brilliant red comet. So comets came up later again in my life. There was a Japanese astronomer named Hayakatake. He was an amateur astronomer who discovered one of the most significant visible comets of recent years, which was in 1995. And I was traveling west through, my husband and I were going out to the Grand Canyon, and we stopped on our way to visit a friend of ours who had a ranch in Kingman, Arizona. And this is what happened when we were there. It's called Birthing Pigs in Kingman, Arizona. Birth such grunting madness, Sal charges across her pen red-eyed, all hooves and dirt. Blood and urine slosh into mud beneath her trampling feet. So we dash to rescue each newborn as it drops. Here's the runt. Maggie passes me her tiny body, cold and pale, half my daughter's size at birth. Snorts and screeches of Sal's labor carry in the wind this biting March dawn. I wipe placenta from her snout, urge this dying runt to life. Mother impulse. I tuck her in my shirt, near my heart, wear her as she sleeps. Her cool skin warms until it matches mine. Maggie trims the tails and canine teeth of every newborn, then counts. 16. Runt still alive? I look beneath my jacket. When I rub her bony chest, she stretches and whines. All night I cradle that pink-eared runt, feed her bottles of warmed cow's milk. Coyotes yap and circle the ranch. We doze. Across a moonless sky, a comet paints trails of green and yellow light. I think I'm going to do maybe just one more. Let's see here. This is a poem. I was recently on a poetry retreat in the Cayman Islands, visiting this area that's land preserved out of development. And it's called the Coast to Bluff Recreational Access and Conservation. And we were there to learn more about Cayman Brac, which is a really interesting island, very different from the other Cayman Islands. Much more rustic, much more, that's where I would say the real Cayman citizens live. It's a beautiful place with amazing beaches and reefs off of the coast. And in the middle of it, a very high brack, which is this elevation created by thrust faults millions of years ago of an underground reef. So it's full of caves and fossils. And I wrote this after I was there, and it's called Songs of the Dead and Dying. Young eye, what do you see when you look through the lace of a dead fan coral? Azure sky, purple cloud pregnant with rain, cobalt of deep current, green curl of shallow wave, stained glass in the church where my father was waked, colors broken, rewoven, light bleeding through. Every tear is a tiny womb that carries a child of grief. All that is, all that was, is transforming, evolving, adapting, becoming petal, becoming breast, becoming cup, becoming boat, becoming fire, becoming smoke. The lost speak in the vireo's voice, their light shining like silver fronds, blessed by morning sun. They dance in orchid scent, in plumeria. They send dreams. I am flying like a frigate bird above an ocean of endless waves. I am swimming in a cloud of parrotfish inside a cradling sea. The dying whisper through osprey's bone, in the femur of goat, in conk's cracked shell, in coconut husk, in ding of stone on the iron shore. Fragile, fragile, fragile. You have forgotten how fragile you are. The dead ask, how will you walk through the world if you close your ears to our song? How can you live without our grace? The dead and dying say, you will never heal alone. Until you dismantle the wall around your heart, your mourning will be an empty belly, always hungry, always devouring. I'll stop there.
Oh, wow. Outstanding poetry. Excellent selections. Thank you, Mary, so much for sharing that. It was awesome, awesome poetry. Thank you so much. Now, at this time, oh, there we go. Now, at this time, we are going to go into the Q&A portion of this podcast. So at this time, if there's anyone in the audience that would like to give Mary a question or a comment, you can unmute yourself and give your question and comment at this time.
I'd like to, maybe I'll put my video on so you know I'm here. I don't have a question for you, Mary. I just wanted to say that I was blown away by how articulate and clear and generous you were in your comments. And I learned a lot from listening to you. And thanks for your beautiful poems.
Oh, thank you, Joan. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for that.
Hi.
Anything else?
Oh,
Hello?
are we done with Joan? Are you done? Yeah. Hi, this is Michael Lynn and calling from San Francisco. Thank you, Mary. Very moving. Have a question about writing, and when you were saying just write a line to start, and sometimes say I'm writing about my mother or my father and the pain, it starts to feel like a betrayal.
Yeah.
Number one, it comes flat, maybe because I'm not digging deep enough, like you said, but number two, it just feels like it's been such a secret for so long. And I'm wondering if you experienced that and how you push through it, please.
Yeah, I think sometimes the first attempts at it, the first efforts to get into that space can feel very flat, right? And I think it took me a long time. The poems, the 11-page poem that I put together from the scraps were taken from poems that were largely failures on their own, like they weren't working. And I couldn't figure out why, but I knew the lines, that some of the lines were right. I knew that that in certain places I'd hit it. And so what I found myself doing is going back over those scraps and finding the places where it was like, no, this is right. This feels right. That sense of betrayal, I think I'm going to be really honest. I didn't publish this book until after both of my parents had passed away. And I think it was in a large part because of that, because I was so afraid of them feeling like it was a betrayal. Ironically enough, when it did come out, and I've had, family members read it. My father's sister, my aunt, read it, and I was a little worried about how she was going to take it. And I sent her a copy of it, and I said, look, there's some tough stuff in here. You can read it or not read it. It's fine. I just wanted you to have a copy of it. And she read the whole thing. She read it from cover to cover. And the interesting thing was that she's a Franciscan nun. So she's kind of like high on my list of people who I care about, in terms, like, I care about what her opinion is. And I was really nervous because I thought, well, shoot, I'm pretty open about a bunch of stuff, including being a bit of a lapsed Catholic. And I was really worried about how she would take it. And she said to me, she said, I sat up all night reading it and rereading it, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. And it opened up so many memories for me. And she totally understood and got it. And I was so overwhelmed by how generous she was in her feedback to me. As I was afraid she might say, what are you talking about? Your parents, that didn't happen. Or, I mean, that's what I think you're afraid of when you start grappling with these secrets, and I know that happens to some people. I know that there are families where everybody's like, no, that's not true. I mean, one of my brothers told me, he said, I didn't know a lot of that was going on. He was a little bit younger than me. And there were things he didn't know about my relationship with my mother. And there were things that she told me that she didn't tell my brothers, I think she saw in me kind of an ally. I was the only daughter. My cousin read it. I write about his mother as well, who was an important person in my life, my aunt. And I sent him a copy of the book, and he's an arc welder. He's not a guy with a college education. And I sent him the book, and I didn't hear from him for a while. And I thought, okay, maybe he didn't read it. And then one day he called me out of the blue and he said, look, I've read your book like 3 times, cover to cover. And he said, look, I don't know what a poem is. I don't know what poetry looks like. I can't even remember when I ever read a poem before. And he goes, but I read and I understood everything you were saying. And he's kind of encouraged me. He thinks I need to write more. He's like, he wants me to come back and spend more time with him. I used to spend summers up there with his family. And I wrote a little bit about that in this book. And he's like, let's come back. There's more I want to show you. And he picked up on all these like subtleties in it. And I knew he would. I actually have an acknowledgement to him in the back of the book, because I think he's a lot like me. He was this sort of very sensitive and open person. And he and I were almost the same age. And we palled around together, we hung out. But, so I understand why people feel reluctant. I certainly did. And I know that it doesn't come right out. It takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of writing, and then it takes a lot of rewriting, and it takes a lot of thinking and being willing to let yourself go there. I mean, I think some of the problem with writing about some of these things is you start wondering, well, what's my role in it? What do I bear any responsibility for what happened? What did I do? And that's hard too. And that's very, very hard, and I think what helps, I don't know, therapy, people who love you in your life, lots of things like that. I don't know. I don't know if that answered your question, Michael.
Yeah, it's a good start. I mean, for me. Yes, you completely answered it. It's a good start for me. Thank you.
Good.
That was definitely a great question. Thank you so much for that.
Thanks.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, for the sake of time, I have time for one more question or comment. Anyone can chime in at this time. Okay, if there's no other questions or comments, I like to give one before we close out. If you could collaborate with any poet, living or deceased, who would it be and why?
Oh my God. Wow. That's kind of like that dilemma of the, the grade school thing of like 10 poems, right? Can you limit it?
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know. Gwendolyn Brooks. So the funny thing about Gwendolyn Brooks is she and I shared a favorite early poet who I feel divided about now is that I'm older, but T.S. Eliot, that was somebody who she also had cited as somebody that inspired her. And I get why, right? She has, he has this ability to like do these amazing lines, right? So even though I think he's a complex person, there's a lot of things about him. If I probably met him, I probably wouldn't like him actually. but he produced these beautiful lines and these beautiful poems. But then she takes that, and I was just thinking about this when I was prepping for this, and I flipped open to I have her book in the Mecca, right? And so this is what she does, like taking in, T.S. Eliot. And I hope we have time for, I'm going to read a little bit of it.
Sure, sure.
So she's finishing this incredible book about, people living in Chicago and the tenements and things like that. And she says, the time cracks into furious flower, lifts its face all unashamed, and sways in wicked grace. Those half-black hands assemble oranges, whose half-black hands assemble oranges is tom-tom hearted, goes in bearing oranges and boom. And there are bells for orphans, and red and shriek and sheen. A garbage man is dignified as any diplomat. Big Bessie's feet hurt like nobody's business, but she stands bigly under the unruly scrutiny, stands in the wild weed. In the wild weed, she is a citizen, is a moment of highest quality, admirable. It is lonesome, yes, for we are the last of the loud. Nevertheless, live. Conduct your blooming in the noise and whip of the whirlwind.
Mhm.
I mean, take that, T.S. Eliot.
Wow, outstanding.
Yeah, but I think there's a piece of me that wants to kind of write about like places like going back to Buffalo and really kind of tackling some of the old neighborhoods and some of the changes in that town. And I feel like if I had somebody like Gwendolyn Brooks working with me, I'd know how to do it. I know her instincts and her writing is just so beautiful and so imaginative, right? And she just has a way of putting things that is powerful.
Definitely. She's definitely a phenomenal poet in her own right, and I can see how that collaboration will play out. I'm sure it would be epic for sure. Now, are there any events or projects or anything happening on your calendar that you would like to share with the audience before we close?
Let's see. I do have, for those of you who are in the Morristown area, I have a reading coming up in November. I have on my website page, which is ghostgirlpoet.com. I have listings of some of the readings and some of the different things that are coming up, and some things are changing. I get new stuff comes on every once in a while, and I post it on there. And I have all my news clippings and little things on there too. Ghost Girl is kind of an avatar for me when I'm writing about my younger self. So.
Excellent. Well, that's awesome. That is so awesome. Well, as we close out, there's just one more thing that I would like to do. Okay. Oh, our screen is shared. Okay, excellent. Oh, there it is. Okay. First off, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you, Mary, so much for being my guest tonight. I truly enjoyed your poetry. I appreciate your creativity. I also appreciate your transparency and your sincerity. I know you shared some things that were very personal and very, things that may have been hard for you to talk about and share, but I thank you for being open to sharing those things. And it is my hope and desire for you that as you inspire and bring healing to others with your words, it's my hope and desire that as you give out inspiration and healing, that inspiration and healing will be returned to you as well. Thank you so much for sharing such beautiful poetry, and I wish you all the best with your current and your future endeavors.
All right. Thank you so much, Noelle. It was really wonderful to have this time with you. I really
Awesome.
enjoyed it.
Awesome. So glad to have this conversation. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, for more information about Poets with Purpose and the P.W.P. Sessions podcast, you can call me at 646-372-6230 or email me at poetswithpurpose@gmail.com. All of my flyers and logos have been designed by the awesome team of Eclipse Graphics. You can find them on Instagram at @Eclipse Graphics NY, where you can see samples of their work and reach out to them for any projects that you may have. Stay tuned for season 3, episode number 3, coming up on Tuesday, October 3rd at 8 p.m. I will be interviewing poet, event host, and just essentially a multifaceted talent in her own right by the name of J Rose. You don't want to miss that interview. It's sure to be an awesome event for sure. For those of you willing or desiring to make a donation, you can do so through PayPal, Tap Media Man, $Anointed Pen, or through Zelly utilizing my phone number. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, this is a wrap for episode number 2 of season 3. Mary, again, thank you so much. This was an awesome conversation, truly inspiring poetry, very thought-provoking. Thank you to my audience. This episode will be uploaded to the Poets with Purpose YouTube channel within the next hour or so. So be on the lookout for that. Once it's uploaded, you are free to share it amongst your social media channels. Thank you all so much. Have a good evening and God bless. Thank you.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night.